by asking each one, let's do this. Let me ask each one of you in the order that you see on the slide here to please go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and your interest and passion in life. And we'll start with David, please.
Hi, Dr. Tom. It's first time, long time, and it's my first time here, so thank you very much. It's my honor and privilege to be here. I love in your keynote how you talked about the end user, the actual customer and things like that. Personally, that's what I'm hyper focused on. I'm here at Oracle Retail, and I'm relatively new on the dark side of the working for the actual software. I grew up, as I like to call it, a button chair planner and allocator. So I'm very familiar with the retail wholesale process of planning and allocating. And now my passion is bringing that day in the life, end-to-end planning experience to technology and to software as we've been talking about it. And just really looking forward to the conversation coming up and all day today.
Hey, it's great to have you personally, and of course your company Oracle join us, the IoT community, at this time, and joining the advisory board. We can't wait for your advice.
Thanks.
Please, next, Iain.
Great, thank you, Dr. Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to be with such eminent people as yourselves. So it's a real pleasure for me. So I'm, as you probably noticed, I'm UK based. I'm an architect, an IT architect, focusing on retail customers, and I have retail customers. So to put it into context, in the UK grocery retail market, there's 5 major supermarkets. I won't name them, but 4 of them are my customers. So I spend all my time speaking to them about the problems and challenges they have in a supermarket. And from that perspective, what I try to do is encourage the use of open source, which is what my company is involved. Is the use of open source to make their lives easier, better. And in reality, what they're doing is they're consuming the food the farmers have just been talking about, and then handing it to consumers. So I look at the retail industry, primarily in the UK, but also worldwide, because I speak to architects in my business in other parts of the world. Retail and how produce is provided to customers to put on the table.
Thank you. And again, Red Hat joining us in the IoT community. That is terrific. I am quite familiar with your location in Raleigh, North Carolina, downtown, and several of your colleagues. So great to have what a pioneering company, and now a well-established software company. Okay, Mark, please tell us about yourself and a little bit about SAS or SAS.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm genuinely happy to be here. So I'm based in Cary, North Carolina, at SAS Institute, where hopefully some of you will visit, as was mentioned earlier, for next year for the SLAM. I'm within the IoT division that I joined when it was formed a few years ago. I'm trained as a toxicologist. I had a career at the bench wearing a lab coat, and I joined SAS 16 years ago as a second career to focus on the math and the modeling associated with studying broadly safety, drug safety, medical device safety. I've also been involved with some of the initiatives we have in agriculture here at SAS. And more recently, and why I'm so glad to be on this panel, is I've been focusing on cold chain and the supply chain, both for food and drugs. We understand that up to 1/3 of new medicines coming online will require a cold chain and rigorous environmental conditions during transport, but also the amount of spoilage and food that is wasted in transport related to cold chain issues is a tremendous concern. And of course, the FDA, it's not the Drug and Food Administration, it's the Food and Drug Administration. And I work very closely with them on many initiatives. So happy to be part of this panel and this discussion, and hopefully I can bring a perspective around what we can do by trace, track, and monitoring of the food supply chain. Happy to be here again.
Thanks, Mark. In addition to Red Hat, SAS is present in the great state of North Carolina, home of the Slim Jim. I don't know if you all know that. Don't Google it now. Pay attention here. But also home of Krispy Kreme donuts. That's the great state. Bill, tell us about Zebra and yourself a little bit.
My fingers were already on the keyboard typing Slim Jim, Dr.
Yeah, I
Tom.
thought so. Yeah.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Bill Enzio. I'm with Zebra Technologies. And at Zebra, we have a portfolio of hardware and software solutions that we deploy in verticals such as retail, transportation, logistics, warehousing, healthcare, public safety. And our hardware and software solutions are designed to both generate and capture data, but then take that data and turn it into meaningful action. And in my role at Zebra, I am focused on the retail technology strategy and focusing on the challenges that our retail customers are certainly facing today, have been facing at new levels over the last 24 months or so. And like David, I am a former end user, former practitioner. So I have a special place in my heart for those folks, and they're top of mind for me whenever we're looking at or designing new solutions for our customers. So looking forward to getting a chance to share on this topic with everybody, and also looking forward to getting a chance to going a little deeper in our retail strategy a little bit later, and I'll provide an overview. So thank you for
Bill,
having me.
thank you. Thank you, all of you. It's great to have you. Those of you listening, you're noticing a retail theme here. Now, the aforementioned keynote we just had was about the production side primarily and producing the goods and the food, and now they move into a supply chain that is going out to distribution channels and eventually retail locations and eventually your table. And that's the domain we're going to talk about here, what we call the food edge, how it gets out to those particular edges after it's produced and is loaded on most likely trucks and trains in the area. And then what happens and how do we deal with that in an efficient way? How do we apply IoT technology? And some of the cutting edge stories that you all have in this domain, it would be great. And we have some questions I'd like to ask you. And then, of course, we'll take questions from the audience here. And please, Iain, it seems you have an interest as we prepared for this in the social responsibility dimension and the waste, dimension of this topic, both in the food itself, obviously, but also efficiencies in the process. Because if they're wasteful in the process with the different tasks, it hurts obviously the business, the enterprise, but it also disappoints the consumer, in many ways. And with that background, how have the demands for consumers translated into positive improvements to complete the food supply chain? What is your view there? That is, when the consumer speaks through demands, through their wallets, through their appetites, how are those things driving changes that you see back into that retail and supply chain domain?
Yes, it's a positive step forward that I've seen in the last couple of years, in that retailers, grocery retailers, are off either consumers or the used or shoppers, as they tend to call them. So shoppers, consumers of food are becoming more aware of their food, where it's come from, how it's processed, its ethical background, how it's distributed, maintained, grown, farmed, etc. So consumers are becoming more aware of the world, and that's translated into pressure onto the supermarkets to respond. And we have just gone, well, it's meat, it's beef, it's chicken, it's corn, it's grain, it's bread, it's whatever, it's come from wherever it is, and we've processed it, and there you go. Supermarkets have now had to recognize that consumers want more detail than that. They want to know, what has happened to that food. Not only is it safe, but is it produced in a manner that fits the lifestyle of the consumer. And consumers are demanding this of supermarkets. So supermarkets are now putting an emphasis on knowing how that food has come to them through the supply chain. Yeah. Because supermarkets don't own the supply chain necessarily. They're just a consumer of that supply chain. But they're feeding back that pressure and that demand for information, leading to positive steps in that every member of that supply chain is now recognizing that information has to be taken from the farm, essentially, aggregated with other information in the supply chain, collated, and then selectively passed forward to the next member of the supply chain, who will then consume that information, then rightfully do what they need to do and pass it on. And that means there's greater collaboration amongst all the parties. There's a greater openness from everybody who is a member of that supply chain. And it's forced the industry, I think, to come together in a better way, and that we collectively, as a group of across multiple industries, are recognizing we can't just act in a silo anymore. We have to share and exchange information. We have to have open standards. We have to be able to take information from our IoT device, pass it on to the next person in a format that they can use. And ultimately, it's making the whole process of knowing what is happening and where your food is coming from more transparent.
I think you're referring to, for the sake of the audience, I think you're referring to ethical sourcing, fair trade.
Yeah, and those are special certain aspects of it. Yes, I mean, some consumers will particularly look for the fair trade
Sustainability
logo or the sustainability, etc.
Yes.
And some people will, some consumers will pay a premium for that. And supermarkets are recognizing that, yes, they can charge a premium if they can supply that information that says, yes, this is ethically sourced.
That is true. And then there's a health halo concept too around.
But there's also consumers who just want to be, sorry, Tom?
Well, I was remarking there's a concept of a health halo that even unhealthy foods are trying to put, around, as well. So lots of interesting psychological and emotional dynamics in the market here, as opposed to just what tastes good and, how cheaply I can get it or efficiently. Thank you. Thank you, Iain, for that. David, can I shift to you here? David, forecasting, I think, is something close to your heart. And how can a more accurate retail forecast now drive supply chain responsiveness and efficiencies as a shift the consumer trends and behaviors? I think we're talking here more about reactionary or before reactionary than predictive, right? How can you predict and respond? Please comment on that and what you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We can address this in a few ways. At the most fundamental level, an increase in accuracy means a decrease in risk, so that means that the retailer, the wholesaler is ultimately going to carry less inventory if their forecast is more accurate. Therefore, that frees up capital, okay? So especially with some things in the pandemic and things with our supply chain uncertainty, that same capital, if you will, can be used for mitigation steps, whether it's investments in technology, distribution infrastructure, turning stores into combinations of distribution centers as well as stores, pre-production investments in the food world that you can do a lot of pre-production and things like that without actually making a finished product. So stuff is kind of like staged and ready to go. But again, it's as you increase that accuracy in the forecast, decreasing where you have inventory and investment in inventory. Also, with the IoT and of things, we can now forecast down to the customer segment level. So I'm sure that Craig can speak much more eloquently to this than I, but really now with ML and AI-driven forecasts, we're able to look at things on a customer segment level, on a transaction level, much faster and be much more responsive. And usually some of the things like the traditional forecasting at SKU store level that would normally with pandemic spikes, that would have been caused, seen as noise and things like that by traditional kind of forecasting models. Today, we can see that entire segments are buying that way right now and quickly react and note that that is a trend that we would want to forecast for and go with in our in our overall forecast. So again, with retail being, as we like to call it, the end of the supply chain, but we also need to take that retail demand forecast and push that back up the supply chain to give it that most accurate forecast we possibly can to know what we need to supply.
Yeah, very, very insightful. And the whole idea here is if you've ever studied statistics or probabilities and you want your forecast to be more accurate, one of the ways is to increase the sample size, which is the same as increasing data, or n, the variable in the mathematics as well. And so the more that we can connect to things, remember the 3 C's: connect, compute, and control. Connect and get more samples, either of the same thing, more samples per second, if you will, or other things we're adding to the end. We can apply that predictive analytics in a way which isn't necessarily AI in the celebrity sense, but I see that your company is looking at that, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but you're actually looking at creating algorithms in those domains as part of your software offerings.
Absolutely. Yes,
Cool.
and at that customer segment level, giving it that larger sampling set. And then the only other thing I'd like to add quickly to this conversation is, again, with the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, the focus on the fulfillment of merchandise, where the customer and in what way that customer wants to pick up that food item or that stereo system or whatever it happens to be. As you say, the thing is the thing, whatever we're talking about, that it's balancing that traditional demand forecast with that fulfillment forecast in the most profitable and efficient way. So we're hyper focused on fulfillment forecasting as well, and applying all of that ML and AI as appropriate to fulfillment and predicting where the customer ultimately wants to pick that up and at what speed and by what means.
And Dr. Tom, at the risk of David and I geeking out here on the call and monopolizing, but I just have to reinforce, we see it very much the same way. The importance of, and to your point, not only being able to increase your sample size, but additive inputs into your demand forecasting with capabilities like demand sensing that can leverage external data sources to help you shape that forecast and condense the time horizon of your forecast so you can have more short-term demand planning based on micro level environmental inputs that can be highly customized. And then with fulfillment, David hit it on the head, being able to not only forecast, but shape fulfillment. Can you incentivize the customers to be able to fulfill that order in a way that is both highly profitable for you, but also a valuable experience for them? And having that level of visibility at that very micro item level, customer level, really does unlock those capabilities so you can start to make those decisions in real time.
Yeah, wonderful. It's we're going to talk about accessibility of these technologies to what I would call underserved populations, but hold that thought for just a moment, because that's a question that's being queued up here. But before we get to that, please, I'd like Mark, you mentioned something in your introduction. It seems you have a passion for safety and sanitation, when it comes to our food, and of course, everyone should and does. But you mentioned the cold chain. Can you, for our audience, can you define it first and then talk about its applicability to sanitation and food safety?
Absolutely, yes. So just a few figures very quickly to introduce this. In the US, possibly 30 to 40% of food is lost due to spoilage. That results in, actually drives foodborne illness, where we have at least 15 to maybe 20% of people in America experiencing disease from foodborne illness, hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations, around 3,000 deaths at least a year from that. So what we're really talking about is first dealing with that food waste, which is tremendous. So it's an economic impact. That then driving the impact to health. And then finally, quality of that food itself in terms of its value. So I think those three issues have driven the economics of oversight, trace and track, and managing of the food supply chain to where it is valuable to introduce technology to help mitigate some of these statistics that I mentioned. And that technology, from my perspective, is the ability to use IoT and edge to trace and track food shipments around the globe and to introduce a level of what I call algorithmic automation. How can a truck, a refrigerated truck, and I'll get to this cold chain in a second, a refrigerated truck transporting food across the country, how can we create a situation where the truck, by sensing the contents in the environment, understands that that food will spoil at a point in time? Let's say the truck breaks down, the refrigeration unit in the truck stops working. How can we automate the decisioning to basically tell the truck driver, divert to this place where that product can be offloaded and not wasted and still used and still potentially sold? So the cold chain really refers to how products are transported around the globe where effectively they are in an environmentally controlled conditions. And cold chain does not just mean keeping it cold, it also means keeping it at ambient temperature, let's say when it's hot outside. So the idea that we can trace and track products to manage the safety, the spoilage, and the value of those products globally, and to introduce through AI and ML algorithms that can help make decisions. What is the next best scenario if the truck breaks down, given what is in the shipment? Do we have to throw away a whole truck of spoiled strawberries, or can we predict that some small percentage of those strawberries is now spoiling, and it will accelerate at a known rate, and by the time you get to where you're going, you have a wasted shipment of strawberries? Wouldn't it be nice to actually have a level of intelligence that says, divert this shipment, take it here, this place will take your strawberries, and you haven't wasted the entire load? So what I'm looking at from SAS's perspective is, can we bring the math and the analytics to be the brain of this intelligent decisioning system that doesn't necessarily need a human to divert a driver to a new location to save a shipment, save it from quality, save it from waste, or potential injury to people when it's consumed. And I hope that gives you a sense of the problem, the possible economics of the solution, and the value that it produces.
Yeah, there's some comments that say those statistics are staggering with respect to waste. There's waste from overproduction. At the end of the day, you throw it out, and then of course the spoilage, as you pointed out as well. It's going to be amazing to see how this technology can be applied and help, if it can be like earlier, like I said, if it's useful data, permissible to use, and then of course, accessible. I like to, you mentioned, please just define then the cold chain again. I don't know if you did define that. I just want our audience to know what that is.
So the cold chain, reference from supply chain, is really the means by which product is transported in environmentally controlled conditions. And more often than not, those conditions require cooling rather than heating. We don't want to cook the food. We basically want to transport it in refrigerators.
So when we have restaurants that advertise never frozen meats, that's still cold.
Absolutely. There's a great sort of example of what I'm discussing. Imagine that you are selling fresh fish and you have a distribution network of refrigerated trucks. Each fish can be different value in different restaurants and how it's prepared. The fish have different levels of freshness given the time they are at a certain environmental state. And imagine that this is a very complex operational research problem, right? It's a traveling salesman. So how can I reallocate my distribution system in real time by understanding which fish is where at which temperature and how long it's been there, so that I deliver the freshest, highest quality fish at the best profit, if you will, and maximize profit, minimize waste, and in doing so, maintain safety. And that is too complicated for individuals to be making decisions. A system like that requires trace, track, sensing of the environmental conditions, understanding the product, and then understanding the consequences, both economic and health, of that product losing its let's say, freshness. So it's a simple example, fresh fish being delivered to restaurants, but it actually represents a very easy way to see what the cold chain can do in terms of benefiting the consumer who eats the fish, the restaurant who sells the fish, and the fisherman who collects the fish, and the people who transport the fish. I hope that gives you a sense of, now imagine multiplying that globally across all products that require some form of environmental control during transport.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. It was very insightful, and we appreciate, of course, the complexity going on. Your company, Mark, David's company, Iain's company are predominantly in the second C, the compute domain, meaning what you produce runs on a computer, of course, and to be engaged in that thinking and that brain and that analytic, is another way to look at the three C's is to convert them to three A's: acquire, analyze, and then act, or connect, compute, and control, as well. However, Bill, you are in a connectivity world, and let me just ask you to comment on this a little bit more free form here before we get to some of the questions. Comment on what you said, what you heard from more of a compute and an analytics role on a connectivity domain, dimension. Just your thoughts on that, what you just heard.
Sure. Yeah, it's something certainly, Dr. Tom, that we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking to our customers about, and really that having that connectivity amongst both the assets that the retailers have in their inventory, as well as the associates that are managing both their inventory investments and taking care of their customers. And the way that we see it is that if we can create the level of visibility and connectivity to both of those things through sensor technology, hardware solutions, and otherwise that are purpose built, but also can generate visibility, and be able to take all of that visibility and turn that into a targeted, meaningful action is highly valuable, and it creates new ways for efficiency to be driven into the operation. And a lot of that is admittedly a little buzzwordy, but it's reality as well. It's something that we're absolutely seeing happen in our customers' operations. And relative to food, the level of visibility that we've been referring to, and as Mark was pointing out, the adjacency to food safety and to wastage and spoilage is absolutely concrete. And what's really interesting and frankly exciting from our view is we're seeing our customers start to leverage that next level of visibility to increase the throughput through their supply chain and drive new levels of velocity through the supply chain. And that helps very much so with things like wastage and spoilage, but it also unlocks options that may not have been an option in the past for how you can service the customer with fresher food, for example. And using maybe the most basic example is, I might have the ability now to serve non-frozen beef to my customers because I have the ability to make decisions that allow me to get that beef to where it needs to be, because I can see the demand coming, I can see the levels of inventory that I have today in my network, and I can provide that experience to the customer. And so there's very much an operational and a social responsibility, environmental component to this. And then there's just a brass tacks business advantage for them, where they can differentiate themselves as a retailer, as a food provider to those customers. And I think that we're certainly seeing it happen already. And I think the adoption and the focus on that is increasing and only going to continue to increase from our view.
And a specific underlying technology question we have is, if we look at the architecture or architecture, technically at the end next to the thing is either a sensor taking in data or an actuator controlling the thing, right? Well, then there's the connectivity networks, and there are many. There's over 200 protocols in the industry, and then the famous ones are Wi-Fi and a cellular 5G, and then of course computing systems and storage, and then back to control systems, which again have connectivity. The question is, are you seeing some of the compute? What's just your observation, Bill, in the industry, moving into that very sensor, so it can compute immediately in what I would call one of the four domains of compute? One's at the sensor, one's at the acquisition, one's at the computer, right? And then the fourth is in the cloud. the edge compute, then in the cloud. But are you seeing the compute shifting left in this model? And smart sensors is a buzzword, but also smart actuators that don't even need to go through the loop of edge compute or the cloud. They're doing it right at the point of data acquisition. Comment on that, what you're seeing.
Absolutely. We're certainly seeing that start to move into, as we refer to the edge, as you mentioned earlier. And it's really about prioritizing the compute that when it's capable of happening inside the edge itself, inside the sensor itself, and being able to bifurcate that computation. Bring my high priority computations here where I can generate an output and an associated action even faster than I could through the cloud, but also still sending information to the cloud for computation when that's appropriate and helpful, so that you can do both in parallel. And we're seeing that start to happen, that shift where you can divide your computation and start to prioritize it, because the capabilities of the technology itself is giving you those options. And so
it's not a new concept in telecommunications. Anyone listening who's been in that business know that not sending all the data everywhere is a good idea, but keeping it cache, keeping it local. Some data value is temporal, so why clog the network? Why
Absolutely.
why even go to an edge compute, as well? Hey, let me shift over to a question that has come in about social responsibility. What are we doing as companies and maybe even individuals with those who are, and I'm going to call it underserved populations? They're also at regions, underserved regions. So what is the act? Let me ask you each to talk about what your companies are doing in that domain, and I'll give you time to collect those thoughts. And let me go first. We're involved in many, as the Hewlett Packard Enterprise Company, many of these initiatives. One comes to mind because I've personally been the executive sponsor of our relationship with smartafrica.org. And it is a consortium of now pushing about 40-ish African countries in the continent of Africa coming together to get digitization moving. A big part of that is connectivity. And a big part of that connectivity is, of course, the cellular domain. And then it might go into a gateway through a Wi-Fi, hub within a village or a town, and building out infrastructures at town halls or libraries or city halls, local places. And then how do we get out, of course, to the villages and distribute first education on hygiene, education on opportunities with microloans to start businesses, empowering women in the communities as well. We see some of these effects being very naturally supported by building an infrastructure. My company plays a role in that, but not all of it. It's end-to-end. It has to be many companies. And the question had to do with, how are we working with, let me call them cellular companies, telecommunication companies, Wi-Fi companies, which are really not us on this particular call. But would anyone want to go first and talk about what your company is doing in that domain of social responsibility with underserved populations? Anyone? Yeah.
I can go. Hi.
Yes, sir.
So very similar to what you just talked about. At Oracle, we're focused on education, environment, and community, and not necessarily in those orders, but in any order. And so specifically on education and in the STEM world and in underserved communities, we have grants, we have specific programs where Oracle gives our employees time off and credit for going out and working in those communities and in those schools, as well as, again, grants to provide educational resources in those underserved communities.
Yeah, thanks, David. Anyone else want to comment?
I can jump in for a moment there, Dr. Tom, and
Yes,
similarly, David, we participate in STEM as well, and we really prioritize our philanthropic efforts in the areas of science, of course, technology, engineering, math, with our STEM involvement, and education and healthcare globally in those underserved communities. And I think probably the I'll call it banner that is most recognizable is the work that we do with the American Red Cross to be able to provide not only support in those areas, but also through donations and through some of the more traditional types of support as in blood banks. And so I think very similar, we have a similar focus globally.
I'll jump in. So
Please, Mark.
SAS is involved in so many issues here. Dr. Goodnight, our founder, has had a long history of incredible engagement in terms of unmet needs, underserved communities. I'll focus on a couple things related to our discussion here very quickly. We have a project called Data for Good, where we engage not only our own analysts and experts, but others from around the world, academic and governmental. We provide our technology to solve very complex problems in the area of food and sustainability and unmet needs. We've had projects around understanding water poverty and how to better identify where and how we can deliver water to unmet needs. We've been working in biodiversity, sustainability, trying to solve the problems associated with bee populations and the role that they play in food. So a tremendous amount of philanthropic effort here at SAS, some of it related directly to the issues we've been discussing. And of course, from my perspective, a tremendous amount of work we're doing in Data for Good in healthcare and better patient outcomes, working on the opioid crisis, improving cancer research. So I could go on and on, but I'll take a breath here and allow somebody else to chime in.
Okay, very good. Please, Iain, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, Red Hat is very similar to all my colleagues on this call. I mean, we have a policy of encouraging collaboration, openness, STEM type activities. But I think the one thing that we stress is one of our corporate values is meritocracy, and everybody has the right to access information, the right to be a participant. And the way we operate our software development models is that we use an open source business model. So all software is open and available. And we like to encourage and make that available to underprivileged communities around the world so that they can have access to software, have access to IT and information. They have every right to have access to the same sort of information that we have, the same sort of IT that we have. By giving them access to the software, they can improve their own communities. They can do what they would like to do in their own community to make their lives better. And there's no reason why they should be charged for that software. Let them have it for free. Let them develop their own community projects. Give them some IoT sensors, and hey, they can make some great things happen in their own little community, in their own little street, in their own village, whatever works for them. And that's where we like to encourage participation outside of the corporate model.
Thank
you.
Iain.
Lots of other things that my colleagues would match as well.
While you have the virtual podium, thank you for that. Can I ask you, I think, I don't know for sure, but close to your heart is interoperability, because of course the open source nature of your company and the work you do as a chief architect, as well. If we look out at collecting data on different protocols, I mentioned earlier, I'm aware of about 200 of these operational technology protocols, in addition, to Zigbee and Wi-Fi and the different types of Wi-Fi and the different types of cellular. The list goes on. And we have, normalization technologies. We can take them all in different formats, create them in the normal, if you will, consistent form so that the analytic can run. Can you make a comment technically on where technology is going with interactivity? Because a big part of the IoT and the things like our food and our supply chain is obviously collecting data with sensors, and it's coming in at all speeds, all types. Some of it is structured, some of it is not. Relational databases don't work, time series databases, etc. I'm throwing out a lot of ideas here, but you are a chief technologist. What's your technology view of the interoperability and making it easier to take a sample from an orange or an apple, and also a sample from a grocery store on who's buying them, and assimilate them together, right, to make a action on supply? Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is you couldn't have picked a harder problem to try and crack. And this hits
It is, yeah.
for many of us. It's this issue, and this is where we talk about openness. We're a great believer in open standards. Let's have some standards. You don't have to always have one standard, but let's have some standards that are open. Everybody has access to the standard. It's not for a privileged few. And if we can create some standards that work and everybody is willing to use them, even if it is only 4, 5, 6, 200 is too many, let's say, get it down to a handful that we can all agree upon. And then by having some open standards, then it opens participation for everyone. And that means more people can then take providing sensors, actuators, and so on, and then sending the data to the recipients. The biggest challenge for a retailer who is a consumer of all this IoT information is they look at it and just go, well, how do I cope with all this information, all this data on different formats, different channels, different protocols? How do I process all of this? It gives them a headache that they would really not want to, they really don't want to have. They want to be able to say, look, just give me the data in this well-defined format, and then I'll go and process it in the way I need to.
I know we're running out of.
Yeah, we are. We're at the top of the hour, and our host is putting tremendous pressure on me. There are threats. There are all kinds of. But okay, David, I'm going to give you the last word here. Go ahead.
It's really quick. I love it, Iain. That's exactly where we're focused right now too. And we're not here to plug our software applications or anything, but with all solutions, we're hyper focused on both having productized, if we'll call it, applications for planners to use end to end to get their best results, but extensible as well. So we're opening our platform. We allow for common tools and the retailer's secret sauce, if you will, and things like that to interact with our productized, dependable end-to-end processes. So I love what you said. Thank you for bringing that up. We're so focused on that.
I'm going to agree. I think there's a lot of leverage in standards. Having co-founded about 7 industry standards in my career, they do help with this problem. So that's one answer on a technology level, is to go after standards and cooperation among companies like are sitting here. I'm going to end with a great big thank you for joining us here, and particularly a thank you to our audience for listening in on the keynote. But let me say, and I think you'd all agree, it's going to get better, right? There are better speakers than us in the future today. So stick around. I will turn it back over to Kevin.